All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know the deal here. We help you get smart fast. And today, we're going to dive deep into something really fundamental to how kids learn to read.
We are. It's all about the connection between executive function skills and decoding. So yeah, basically how being able to focus and pay attention is linked to actually being able to read the words on the page.
Exactly. And we're not just theorizing here. We're going deep into a pretty massive research project, right?
Right. A huge meta-analysis that looked at 65 different studies.
Wow, 65.
Yeah, with data from over 10,000 young
So
people.
that's a lot of data.
Yes, a lot of data.
All right, so our mission today is to really understand, I guess, how these executive functions, things like holding information in your mind, being able to switch between tasks and, not getting distracted, contribute to decoding. And of course, decoding is like the bedrock of reading comprehension. You can't understand what you're reading if you can't decode the words.
Absolutely. And one of the really interesting things that this meta-analysis found was a pretty consistent pattern of small to moderate correlations between these executive function skills and how well these kids, children, and adolescents could decode words. And that goes for both real words and even those made-up nonsense words.
Okay, so before we get too far into it, let's define some terms here. Decoding.
Mhm.
What exactly do we mean when we say decoding? Because it's not just about like sounding out letters.
Yeah.
It's more than that.
Yeah, it's definitely more than that. I mean, it does involve using those orthographic patterns, which is a fancy way of saying like the way letters are arranged in a word to figure out how it's pronounced. But it's really about being able to kind of quickly and efficiently retrieve the spoken form of those written letters.
Okay. So it's not just like, okay, C-A-T, cat. It's more about like seeing cat and just knowing that's cat immediately.
Exactly. And there's actually a theory called the dual route model, which suggests that there are two main pathways we use when we read. One is that sounding out route, and the other is, like you said, recognizing words we've seen before. Decoding kind of underpins both of those routes. It allows us to make that connection between the written symbols and the sounds of language.
Okay, that makes sense. So then executive functions,
Yeah.
or EF,
Mhm.
what are we really talking about here? Like in simple terms, what are these brain skills?
It's basically our ability to concentrate and pay attention to control our thoughts and actions. So it's those higher level mental processes that help us manage what's going on in our brains.
Okay.
And this meta-analysis looks specifically at three key aspects of EF.
Okay, and what are those three?
So the first one is working memory updating, which is often just called working memory. You can think of it as like your brain's mental notepad, that ability to hold on to information in your mind and work with it.
Okay, so like remembering a phone number while you're dialing it.
Exactly. And in the context of decoding, that might mean holding on to the sounds of the beginning of a word while you're trying to sound out the rest of it. Now, previous research on this link between working memory and decoding has been a little bit mixed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, some studies haven't found a strong connection, especially with younger kids, but other studies, particularly those looking at older elementary school students or kids who have difficulty reading, they have found stronger links. So the thinking is that if you're not decoding automatically, you might need to hold on to more pieces of the word in your mind at the same time.
Right, because you're having to work through it more consciously.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's working memory. What's the second EF skill?
The second one is task switching. Sometimes it's called cognitive flexibility or mental shifting. It's our ability to smoothly switch between different rules or tasks in our minds.
So like I'm writing an email and then my phone rings and I answer it and then I go back to my email.
Yeah, exactly like that. And when it comes to decoding, especially in English, which has like a lot of irregular spellings, we might need to be able to switch back and forth between sounding out a word and just recognizing a familiar part of it. There's actually some research suggesting that this link between task switching and decoding might become less important as kids get older and their reading gets more fluent.
Really? Why would that be?
Well, the theory is that as decoding becomes more automatic, you don't have to consciously switch between different strategies as much. You just kind of do it without thinking.
Okay, so it's kind of like riding a bike. Like at first you're really thinking about every movement, but then eventually you just do it.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. And what about the third executive function?
The third one is inhibitory control. This is all about blocking out distractions and suppressing irrelevant information. So when you're reading a word, there might be other words that look similar, but you need to be able to focus on that target word and not get thrown off by those other words.
Right, so like if you're reading the word there, You don't want to get it confused with there or there.
Exactly. But similar to working memory, the research on the direct link between inhibitory control and word reading has been kind of mixed. Some studies haven't found a strong connection, while others have. There's even a theory that maybe inhibitory control has a more indirect effect on decoding. Like maybe it supports a child's phonological awareness, which is their understanding of the sound structure of language.
Okay, so it's not necessarily directly affecting decoding, but it might be influencing other skills that are important for decoding.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so those are the three key executive functions that they looked at. Now, putting it all together, what did this meta-analysis tell us about the overall relationship between executive functions and decoding?
Well, overall, they found a significant moderate correlation. The average correlation, which they called RZES, was 0.32. Yeah, so a correlation of 0.32 might not sound huge, but in a field like learning, where there's so many factors at play, it actually suggests a pretty meaningful and consistent connection, even if it's not the only thing that matters.
Right.
And what was really interesting is that this link was pretty much the same whether kids were reading real words or those made-up nonsense words.
Okay, so that suggests it's not just about recognizing familiar words. It's really about the underlying process of decoding itself.
Exactly.
Do they find that any one of those three EF skills, working memory, task switching, or inhibitory control, was like a stronger predictor of decoding ability than the others?
So they looked at those correlations separately, and honestly, they were all pretty close. Working memory showed significant correlations, ranging from 0.31 to 0.34 with both word reading and non-word reading.
Okay.
And task switching also had significant correlations, around 0.30 to 0.31 for both types of reading. Inhibitory control was a little higher for word reading, around 0.34, but a little lower for non-word reading at 0.28.
Yeah, I mean, those are all pretty similar numbers.
Exactly. So it doesn't seem like one of them stands out as being way more important than the others. And another important finding was that whether a child was reading real words or made-up words didn't really change the strength of the connection between their executive function skills and their decoding ability.
Okay, so the link is there across the board.
Mhm.
But with so many studies and so many participants, I imagine there were a lot of other factors they had to consider, right? Like, did they look at things like age, gender, or even the language being read?
Yeah, absolutely. They looked at a whole bunch of potential moderators, things that might make that connection between EF and decoding stronger or weaker in different groups of kids. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the things you might think would matter actually didn't have a significant impact.
Oh, really? Like what?
Like the biological sex of the participants, so whether there were more boys or girls in a study, that didn't make a difference.
Interesting.
Also, the spoken language, whether it was English or some other language, that didn't change the relationship either. And even the type of writing system, whether it was an alphabetic language or a different kind of writing system, no significant difference there.
Wow.
And this is a big one, the orthographic depth of the language.
Mm.
So how consistent the spelling patterns are. You might think that a language like English, where the spelling can be pretty unpredictable, would make a bigger difference, but it didn't.
That's surprising.
It is. They also looked at the type of task that was used to measure the executive functions. So whether it was like letters and numbers or more visual patterns, and whether the child had to give a verbal response or point to something, none of those things seemed to change the relationship.
So if all those things didn't matter, what did? Like, was there anything that significantly affected that connection between EF and decoding?
Interestingly, the study designs seemed to matter. So studies that were purely correlational, where they just looked at the relationship between EF and decoding at one point in time, those tended to show stronger connections than studies that used other designs, like longitudinal studies that follow kids over time or intervention studies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the researchers thought maybe this was because correlational studies are sometimes better at controlling for other factors that could influence the results. But they also pointed out that there weren't as many of those other types of studies in their analysis.
So more research is needed.
It would definitely be helpful to have more research using different study designs.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about different types of studies, but what about the age of the participants?
Yeah.
I know you mentioned earlier that the link between task switching and decoding might change as kids get older. Did the meta-analysis as a whole say anything about the role of age?
Yeah, they did. Overall, they found a small negative moderating effect of age, which means that the connection between executive functions and decoding might get a tiny bit weaker as kids get older. And they did this really complex analysis where they looked at changes over time, and that supported this idea. This kind of fits with a theory called Perfetti's verbal efficiency theory, which basically says that as kids get better at reading, decoding becomes more automatic, and that frees up their cognitive resources to focus on understanding what they're reading.
Right, because they don't have to work so hard to figure out the words anymore.
Exactly. Now, when they looked at each of the executive function skills individually, this effective age was only statistically significant for task switching.
Okay, so that connection between being able to switch between mental tasks and decoding, that one seemed to weaken as kids got older.
Right. And they also found something interesting about the type of task used to measure executive function. For tasks that didn't involve letters or numbers, the association with decoding got weaker as kids got older. But that wasn't the case for tasks that did use alphanumeric stimuli.
Hmm. Okay, so we have this consistent link between executive functions and decoding, and it seems to change a bit as kids get older, especially when it comes to task switching. But why does all this matter? Like, what are the practical implications here?
Well, I think it's really important for understanding why some kids might struggle with reading. Even subtle difficulties with executive function skills could impact how efficiently a child can decode words, and that can have a domino effect on their overall reading development.
It's like if you're struggling to decode, you're spending so much mental energy on that that you don't have the resources left to focus on comprehension.
Right. And then there's this idea of the Matthew effect in reading, where kids who start out as good readers tend to get more practice and get even better, while kids who struggle early on might avoid reading and fall further behind.
Yeah, that makes sense.
This research also suggests that we might be able to use our understanding of executive functions to identify reading difficulties earlier. Just like we look for early signs of math learning difficulties, we could be looking for signs of EF difficulties that might impact decoding. And it's not just about early elementary school. This study highlights that these connections between cognitive skills and reading are important all the way through adolescence.
That's really helpful. But I know with any research, especially a meta-analysis like this, there are always limitations to consider. What are some of the key limitations of this study?
Well, first of all, because this was a meta-analysis of correlational studies, we can't say for sure that executive functions cause better decoding or vice versa. It could be that there's some other factor that's influencing both.
That's the classic correlation does not equal causation problem.
Exactly. Also, measuring executive functions in kids is tricky. Some of the tests used in these studies might not be perfectly reliable, and the researchers noted that the original studies didn't always report how reliable their EF measures were.
So the tools themselves might have some limitations.
Right. And there's also the fact that different studies might define and measure executive functions a little bit differently. This meta-analysis focused on those three core components: working memory, task switching, and inhibitory control. But there are other aspects of EF, like planning and monitoring, that weren't really looked at in relation to decoding.
Right.
Plus, there are fewer studies on task switching and inhibitory control in the context of decoding than there are on working memory. And most of the studies used word reading tasks, so we need more research on non-word reading.
Okay.
And then there's the issue of representation. Most of the studies focused on middle and late childhood, so we need more research on younger and older kids.
Right.
And almost all the studies were done in alphabetic languages, and this particular meta-analysis only included studies published in English. So we have to be careful about generalizing these findings to other languages and writing systems. Finally, like with any meta-analysis, there's always the chance that some relevant studies were missed or that there's some bias in what gets published. But their statistical analysis didn't suggest that was a major problem in this case.
Okay, so lots of interesting findings, but definitely room for more research. So to wrap things up, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key message is that executive functions, those core skills of working memory, task switching, and inhibitory control, consistently play a role, albeit a small to moderate one, in how well children and adolescents can decode words.
And that relationship, while stable overall, might change a little bit as kids develop, especially in terms of how task switching is involved.
Exactly, and this raises a really interesting question. How can we use this knowledge to support early literacy development? Should we be thinking beyond just phonics instruction? Should we be incorporating activities that specifically target working memory, cognitive flexibility, and the ability to focus and avoid distractions? What could this mean for educators and parents who are trying to help kids build a strong foundation for reading? I think this deep dive is really just the start of a much larger conversation about the science of reading and the importance of executive functions.
Absolutely. And we encourage all our listeners to keep exploring these ideas and thinking about the implications for themselves and the young people in their lives. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.